John, your book, published by American University of Cairo Press in 2020, is actually titled Missions Impossible in the plural, indicating more than just one mission. I will start with sharing my favorite quote from chapter 1, in which you outline some of the goals and constraints on public policy. Quote, "The ultimate constraint, the mother of red lines, is regime survival. In that context, I have long ago ceased to heed Cassandra-like warnings that the status quo is not viable. To the contrary, the status quo and business as usual are viable, albeit suboptimal. Failing to understand why they are viable and who their beneficiaries are will consign any advice preferred to incumbents to the back of a dusty drawer." With that, we'll start with asking, who did you write this book for, and what is the intended audience? Who do you want to read it?
Well, people like yourself. I am focused mainly on those who work in academia and probably, like myself, haven't reflected all that much on the institutions in which we work. It was only when I took on a leadership role that I began to think seriously about how universities function, and also to policymakers, and particularly policymakers in the Arab world, who are going to affect educational policy going forward. One of the assumptions of the book is that higher education in the Arab world is in a kind of long developing crisis, and it's going to require explicit policy measures to deal with the crisis. So I hope I've been able to frame some of the choices, some of the challenges that policymakers are going to face going forward. I doubt if any are going to be big surprises for those who are involved in higher education. But I do try to give a pretty big picture that goes across the entire Arab region and also includes Turkey and Iran.
Okay, so you start and you finish your book by saying you are trying to promote supportive rather than disruptive innovation. Implicit is the belief that Arab political regimes are adaptable, which I imagine you realize is a somewhat contested notion. You also say that you have come to the surprising conclusion that the state of higher education in the MENA is not as bad as it is often portrayed. So can you elaborate on that, and why was this conclusion surprising?
Yeah, the literature I had read leading up to writing the book often emphasized the degree of crisis in higher education. And I pretty much bought into that. And it was only after I had done considerable research that I realized that in many ways, in terms of many of the goals that policymakers had set for higher education, the Arab world hadn't done too badly over the last 40 or 50 years. It had achieved several of its major objectives. So I realized I had to back away a little bit from the notion of a dramatic crisis. I'm not wondering, I'm going to suggest I read something that I saw very recently, which gives you a flavor of how others view the situation. Now, this is written by Safwan al-Masri, who is now back at Columbia University, but Palestinian Jordanian, who wrote the following: "Indeed, elsewhere in the Arab world, education systems have evolved, or rather devolved, through decades of deliberate attempts to suppress the Arab mind, resulting in generations of poorly educated, narrow-minded, intolerant individuals, ill-equipped for participation in a globalized world. When education is used primarily as a tool to solidify nationalist loyalty and political legitimacy where there was none, it is unsurprising that hyper-nationalist propaganda, exclusionary rhetoric, and dogmatic religious discourse are now the defining features of contemporary Arab education systems. That was a not untypical blast, and that you can go back 15, 20 or more years and find similar summaries and similar analyses. And I guess I came to the conclusion that they're somewhat misplaced, that a lot has been achieved, and we often overlook it because some of the negative aspects capture our attention at the expense of the positive.
So if you can expand on that a little bit and tell us what do you think the system got right, and how do we avoid the trap of falling into Arab exceptionalism, in the sense that everything that we're doing in the Arab world is wrong?
Yeah.
It's the other kind of exceptionalism in which we see ourselves as not distinguished, but rather on the other side. So if you can tell us what's happening, like what's going well for us and what we can build on.
Right. Well, I don't dismiss the notion of Arab exceptionalism in political terms. Like yourself, I've seen so many quantitative studies that show certain features of the Arab world that do define a kind of exceptionalism. The problem is not so much the conclusion people come to, it's in trying to explain why. And the explanations are often contradictory or inconsistent, and I won't go into them, even though it's kind of tempting to do so. So what I would argue in terms of higher education is that there is a kind of exceptionalism that I try to analyze in looking at the employment prospects of young Arab graduates. And we know, and I know the Arab Barometer is documented in many ways, the extraordinarily high rates of youth unemployment and educated youth unemployment in the Arab world. They are unlike any other region in the world, including sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, East Asia. So there is something that demands an explanation there, and I try to get into that crisis of ill-prepared students for the existing job markets, and also, equally important, an ill-prepared private sector for the kinds of graduates universities are producing. I think there's a structural problem, and let me give you an example of why I think it's structural. 2008, we had a global financial crisis. It hit the European countries of the Southern Mediterranean very hard, particularly Greece, but also Italy, Spain, Portugal, Cyprus. And we saw youth unemployment skyrocket in all of those countries, up to levels that approximated Arab levels of youth unemployment. But with time, it turned out that for the Southern European countries, this was a cyclical problem, not a structural problem. And unemployment rates began to go down, not to where most leaders would like to see them, but significantly lower than what we find in the Arab world. Meanwhile, the Arab world is still stuck at its kind of 25% educated youth unemployment rates, regardless of country. I noticed, for instance, that even though Tunisia is touted as the one country to have succeeded in the Arab Spring, it hasn't made any difference to youth unemployment in the Tunisian economy. The economy functions largely as it did prior to 2011. Youth unemployment is still very high, and it's facing this same structural problem. So I think trying to find out the reasons for this structural dilemma in the Arab world gets at the issue of exceptionalism.
Okay, so you outline, in the book, you outline the trilemma of higher education, which is quantity, quality, and cost. And you argue that only two of the three can be achieved, and that Arab universities have sacrificed quality. Is this due to economic or political reasons? I.e., is it because Arab universities have struggled to keep up with economic transformations and developing job markets, or is it because the public policy choices are stuck in the political bargain of producing bureaucrats?
Well, I see it, I guess, largely in economic terms, and in terms of the costs of the famous social contract or social contracts that were set up in most Arab countries following independence. There was a certain sameness to them, even though in some ways, some countries were aligned with the West and some countries aligned with the Soviet Union during the Cold War. In terms of the social contract, there wasn't necessarily all that much difference. And one of the commitments was to education in general as a force to liberate the citizens of these newly independent countries, and higher education in particular to underscore the independence and economic autonomy of these new nations. That commitment, I think, was laudable, and I certainly don't feel uncomfortable with it at all, but it had a very high economic cost, as did the social contract in general. And as we have seen in so many other analyses, by the 1970s, funding these social contracts became extraordinarily difficult. And specifically in higher education and education in general, we began to see a cutback in a lot of spending ratios, spending per capita, spending as a percentage of GDP, et cetera, and opening the doors to the private sector, which I saw as an act of desperation on the part of many Middle Eastern leaders, because they could no longer find the resources to continue to fund education at the levels they wanted. So they hoped the private sector could step in with the implicit concession that the private sector was going to charge for its services.
Okay, so you offer a remedy for the trilemma, as you propose turning the university into an entity with 3 goals only: graduating 85% of the students, 80% of whom would find employment, and all of whom would pay off their costs in 10 years. So, in essence, you're proposing that the Arab university double down on teaching and shun research and other goals, changing the value proposition of the university as a whole. This seems to be the exact opposite of where higher education in the rest of the world is going. I mean, we see that in the US, at least for large public research universities, research is of paramount importance, probably like more important than teaching. So can you elaborate on the logic behind changing the value proposition of the university as a whole?
Well, first, let me say that proposal or suggestion was meant to be provocative. I don't necessarily believe in it myself. It would run contrary to everything I've done in my own career, and certainly what I was doing at AUB. But I wanted to emphasize that part of the title of the book, The Missions Impossible, to suggest that the university has too many official missions, and they're often contradictory, and they all cost a lot of money. And I don't see how university leadership anywhere in the Arab world can fulfill all those missions. The trilemma that you've already mentioned is a core part of the contradictions. You want quantity, you want quality, and you want to be able to deliver it at a reasonable cost. And that so far has eluded the Arab world, except in the oil-rich countries, where we could say the costs have been unreasonable. They spend a great deal of money on education and higher education. So we've got the trying to remember where I was going with this. We've got the trilemma, the conflicting missions, and I suggested that you might want to reduce to a very simple group the criteria by which performance of higher education is judged. As I say, it was meant to be provocative. It flies in the face of a lot that I hold dear. but we're facing some major challenges now in the Arab world, and this might be one way to deal with them. At least it should be put on the table.
No, I think it is provocative, and I think I want to do it justice. I mean, you don't say it just fleetingly. You do actually provide concrete recommendations about how to achieve some of this in the conclusion. And I want to encourage our attendees to read the book to give it justice. I mean, it is a provocative proposition, but not entirely unreasonable given the state of the Arab public university and also the state of higher education throughout the world. So